So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming back after lunch. I hope you all had some delicious lunch. The lasagna was fantastic, I thought, but as well the mousse au chocolat. Welcome to chapter 3. The chapter 3 is called Transgenerational Heritage. We will have a panel discussion here. My name is André. I'm a physician and data scientist, and I'm happy to moderate this session together with our amazing panelists. I will briefly introduce our 3 panelists, and we will start to spark on the discussion with some questions to our panelists. But then we would also like to engage with you to get your thoughts on transgenerational heritage and to engage in some interesting discussions around that. We have about 1 hour for this event, so we think about having 20 minutes with our panel here, and then we will welcome any questions from the audience, from you guys, okay? So first I want to introduce our 3 panelists here. You know them maybe from the morning. We have Saskia, who is a mathematician by training, equipped with a big interest in medical research and thus an additional training in biostatistics. She worked on bringing mathematics into cancer research and how mathematical modeling could help to understand cancer development and by this means improve cancer treatment and prevention. In particularly, she is focused on the most common inherited cancer syndrome called Lynch syndrome. And here a genetic variant is potentially passed on from parents to children, which highly increases the risk of cancer. This is Saskia. We also have Héctor. He's a sociolinguist working here at the Heidelberg Center for Ibero-American Studies at the University of Heidelberg, and his research interests focus on the cultural and social scientific analysis of multilingualism, education, internalization, and interculturality. He is particularly interested and examines the social and demographic dynamics of Spanish as a migratory language in Europe, addressing the factors that influence the intergenerational transmissions of the heritage language in Spanish-speaking families. Welcome, Héctor. And we have Anja. Anja is a psychologist and a psychotherapist by training. A few years ago, she started doing research in the clinic of palliative care. And she's especially interested in mental and psychosocial health at the end of life. The question arises as to what people in this phase of life can do to improve their quality of life, but also what they can leave behind for their loved ones. So this is our panel, and maybe I would like to start the discussion by asking all of you, what does heritage mean in your field? Could we please have a statement from all of you regarding this? What does heritage mean in all of your fields? Please, Saskia.
Yeah, so maybe I can start. So as this is related to cancer, this is mostly a medical or biological definition. And it means in my research that a genetic variant is passed on from parents to children, and by this leading to some predisposition for some type of disease, in my case cancer. So we really look at specific genetic variants, so variations in the DNA that then are passed on from one generation to the other.
Héctor, please.
Thank you for the question. This is a crucial question, or one of the crucial questions. In linguistics, we have, or there is a quite new research field about the so-called heritage languages or heritage speakers. What is a heritage speaker? A heritage speaker is a bilingual with 2 languages. One of these languages is the socially dominant language, such as German in Germany, and the other language is the heritage language. They have high competencies in this language, but this language is also something that connects the speakers with their roots. And in this definition, we have 2 dimensions of heritage that I would like to highlight. The first dimension is vulnerability. Heritage languages are vulnerable because they are in this non-dominant position in the countries. They have no support in education and they are some scholars call them at the beginning kitchen languages, because they are only spoken at home and mostly only in the kitchen. And you see how these speakers have a very, very developed lexicon about food and things related to the kitchen, but not in other domains of the language. And the second, and this dimension, and this is maybe important for the discussion later, is related to that heritage language is something that has to be protected because it's vulnerable. And the second dimension of the definition is temporality. Because I said the heritage language is something that connects the speakers with their roots. And what is roots? The roots of the heritage speakers is many things. It's the genealogy of the family. It's also the cultural roots of the origin of their parents. But it has also to do with the biography and the history of the migratory experiences of these families. So we have these two dimensions, vulnerability and temporality. Yeah, we can discuss later about this and other important things about heritage.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really interesting already to see like a heritage, either in medicine, passing on a genetic variation or mutation, heritage language, how temporality and vulnerability, of course, also plays a crucial role in medicine. You have vulnerable cancer genes, if you want to, that can, after a brief or a short period of time, sometimes also after a long period of time, can be passed on. Yeah, really interesting. Anja, please, what is heritage in your field?
I was thinking about two aspects, actually. Like one thing, and that's pretty close connected to my research in palliative care, is what parents physically leave their children when they die. And I was talking about the family audiobook project earlier, where parents record an audiobook for the children, so something they can receive and they can have. And the other thing that's probably a little bit more connected to my work as a psychotherapist, what parents leave their children, like ideas and rules, and like what they think is important to how to raise their children. And that's something the children take with them, but not as a thing, but like inside of them.
Also really interesting. Yes, so as physical, but as well as values, morals that get passed on from generation to generation. Interesting. Okay. So we have some understanding now of heritage in different fields. When we talk about now the panel discussion, transgenerational heritage, we have heritage now, but there is another word left, generation, right? So maybe if you could also briefly state, and maybe we continue with you, Anja, what is a generation in your field? Like, when does one generation start? When does the other begin? When does it end?
That's a really interesting question, because I never thought about that so specifically. But like the first word that came into my mind was generativity, which is used in psychology every once in a while, where people want to give their thoughts and their ideas and their learnings and their experiences to the next generation. And that could be within a family, like parents or grandparents want to teach their children and grandchildren, but also within kindergarten or school, like teacher want to like give knowledge to the next generation.
Thank you. Héctor, are there also generations in languages? Is there a grandparent language? Is there grandchild language? How does it work?
There are many languages. You can differentiate many languages regarding the generations. We talk also about the 1.5 generation, which is the children that move with their parents to other country. For example, by the age of 10, and they socialize in the country of destination. This is a kind of one-point generation. It's not the second generation of children that were born in the new destination, but it's a kind of transition. And also in the family, you have, in some families, you have homes composed by different generations of speakers, the abuelas in the, the grandmothers in the US, in the Latino communities. Which is a very important factor for the transmission of the Spanish language in the US. So the sociolinguists talk about the abuela factor, which is if you have your grandmother at home, the probability to maintain the language between generations is higher than in other families. So, but I think there is another interesting thing about generation and language in general, which is in our reality everywhere, there are different languages coexisting depending on the generation. So we have, in dictionaries, in textbooks, the language of the grandparents, of the elderly. And we have in television, in some channels, we have the language which is in some ways different of the young generations. And between the young and the old generations, you have many different speech communities depending on age, which coexist in the same time, in the present. And the question is, what is the German language? What is the sum of every speech community in the between these different generations?
Thank you. Yeah, completely different definition from a generation compared to what Anja said. Saskia, mutations can have, of course, an important effect on generations. What comes to my mind is, of course, like in med school, you were always taught about the impact of cancer, the impact of mutations on generations by the example of the English royal family and the example of hemophilia, like a blood disease, and where you can see in the generations across the royal family that complete parts of the family were wiped out due to that disease. So generation in the context of mutations can be a more unpredictable factor, right? Anja mentioned that to her, the generation directly starts and ends with two people, if possible, like one person gives a heritage from one generation directly to the other, but this can be completely different in terms of mutations, right?
Yeah, fully agree. So I think that when talking about mutations, and we mostly talk about genetic variants, which is a bit broader, this is particularly interesting because this is exactly what I think also the medical experts are looking for. So what are these mutations or genetic variants that really have an influence on the whole family history? And this is exactly what we are looking at when we're talking about inherited cancer, is that we look at the family history. So we really build these family trees and then see who had cancer, who had not, and also which type of cancer. And by this mean try to understand the hereditary pattern that we see through the generations. And of course, you can imagine that we look for all the genetic variants that could happen, and this is like the DNA is really huge. We have billions of base pairs that can have a variant that can be mutated, and by this means it's really difficult to really define what is where exactly this mutation happens. And this is also why we apply computational models to this, to be able to get an understanding of this huge data set that we have. And then you can see, okay, well, we have one data set analyzed, which is from one patient, but then you have to include the whole family history. And this is why we also take into account different factors, not only the DNA, but then also look at more clinical parameters like really age and sex and so on, to define what this actually means and how these mutations are then passed on.
Interesting. So Did you see a difference? Like you mentioned the family trees, like this is how it has been done like for generations now, like drawing family trees to see where the genetic mutations can be passed on to a family. Similar to Héctor could draw a family tree for languages, where does it originate and where does it come from? But what has changed with computational analysis? Like you mentioned that you still draw those trees, so it doesn't seem to be that like computational analysis has replaced all of the traditional analysis, but what has changed by the use of computational analysis? Is it just more information that you can analyze, more data?
Yeah, I think this is, of course, one point. So we have different type of data that we can now include into our analysis to draw the conclusions about is this an inherited type of cancer or not. So this is not only about the family trees, but it's also about really the DNA information that you have. It's about the clinical parameters. Sometimes it's also the molecular information. So you really look at the images of these tumors in the end to get an idea of what was going on. That is the most important question always, not of what will be going on, but what was the past and where did we come from. And so it's about the complexity of the data that we can now analyze, and also simply the amount, I would say. And this, of course, opens up whole new possibilities to answer new questions that could arise, and to get a better understanding of really what is going on. And by this means also be able to develop treatment and prevention strategies that are really necessary for these patients.
And you also just mentioned the importance of data nowadays. Computational analysis is really helpful when we have complex, when we have large amounts of data that our human minds cannot process on their own, or at least not that fast. And I have a fairly good understanding of medical data or genetic data, where we can get this from, but I have fairly little knowledge about Héctor's work. Where does your data come from? I understand that you work with languages, that you look at the generational transitions between the languages, how they migrate, how they alter. But I cannot look that up on the internet, can I? Or can you? Or where do you get your data from the analysis?
This is a very good question, and it's very difficult to answer in 2 minutes, but I am trying. As you mentioned, we use many different data or sources. On type of data, we use the demographic data in order to describe migratory movements, also these transitions between generations. And there is, in my field, there is a very, very differentiated traditions between quantitative and qualitative analysis. So in a way, and qualitative data are very important in my field, because as you mentioned, if you want to take a look what happened in families in the intergenerational transmission of languages, it's not so easy to quantify some important aspect related to emotions, to connection to the roots, as I mentioned in the definition, and other symbolic importance of the transmission of languages, which play an important role in the fact if and why and how a language is transmitted. But if you want to understand how, so to say, are the different competencies of heritage speakers and how they can develop high-level competencies in the heritage language, then you have to apply quantitative methods, because you need to measure language use. And we have a very huge problem in this field, because traditionally we have a lot of instruments in order to measure language competence, but for foreign learners, not for native speakers. And heritage speakers are in a kind of in between native speakers and also second language speakers. So one of the challenges, and maybe this new technological developments can help in this challenge, is to create appropriate instruments for the measure of the competence of these speakers.
And of qualitative data. Maybe if you could briefly elaborate for our audience. I don't know whether everybody here is familiar with qualitative analyses. Of course, we have also many people from the natural sciences here who are more used to working with quantitative data. What is qualitative data? What is qualitative analysis?
Oh, there are also many types, but we can talk about two kinds, maybe, in order to briefly describe this thing. So you have field work data. In my case, it could be there are many anthropologists and linguists of this tradition. They go to the families and stay with them during days, trying to describe the ways in which they use the languages at home, what kind of practices the linguistic practices they have in the. So then they make a kind of report of these interactions. You can record it also, and then use these videos in order to analyze this data. So you could describe interactions. This is the one part. And the second tradition in qualitative analysis is interviews. So you speak to you try to connect, to speak with the participants, in this case the families, the children, but also of course the stakeholders of the family, the parents, and in this data you have to gain how they make sense of their practices. So the thing is, you have to recreate these meaning-making decisions, these meaning-making elaborations of the individuals related to the linguistic practices, and also the transmission of the language. So we will have these two kinds of qualitative data: interviews and description of field work descriptions.
Thank you. Yeah. And for everybody who has never worked with qualitative data, I can assure you, sure, mathematics, computational analysis are pain, but coding interviews, analyzing qualitative data is also pain. So, but Anja, you mentioned also with respect to your audiobooks that you did a lot of interviews with the families and about that. And you specifically used one term, generativity, to describe this process or a lot of the information you gained here. Could you please briefly elaborate what is generativity? What do you understand?
Mm-hmm. Well, the short answer is, well, no, let me start with generativity is a term a psychotherapist started to use, Erik Erikson, and he tried to describe that especially adults over 40 start to like find a need in themselves to like pass on their knowledge, pass on their experiences to younger generations, and that's the beginning of the term of generativity. And today it's described for several fields. It's like on an individual level, where like parents or grandparents try to pass on their knowledge to their children and grandchildren, but also in a more like with a view of our society, like in schools, in kindergarten, universities, where people try to pass on their knowledge. So yeah, so it's like a broad term for different aspects of passing on knowledge and experiences.
How was that journey for you to like conduct all of those interviews, to extract all of those insights? But you also went a step further then, right? You created those audiobooks, you gave something back to the people, like...
Yeah, like the idea, well, there is that project of the family audiobook where terminally ill parents can record those audiobooks, and we were interested in understanding how this process of recording might be helpful, but also where it might be very painful or not as helpful as we hoped in the beginning. And so we tried to find people with who were terminally ill, who were interested in recording those audiobooks. And in the beginning, I was expecting that way more people wanted to record an audiobook than we had spots. But actually that was not the case. A lot of people liked the idea, but said, no, thank you, I don't want to do that, for several different reasons. And those people who decided to record an audiobook, we asked afterwards, like, what was the experience like? What was helpful? What was not helpful at all? And I think all of them described it as a really good experience to, first of all, talk about the illness, talk about their lives, get an idea or remember how rich their life was, what they can tell their children, but also how exhausting the process was and how painful it was to talk about their end of life and know that their children, they won't see their children grow up. So yeah, I think it's it was a very personal journey for all of them. And I think one thing I learned from that, like, I like the idea of the audiobook, but it doesn't mean that everyone does, and it doesn't mean it's helpful for everyone. And it's really important, I think, for people to be able to choose if they want to, like, it's not only 3 days of recording, but preparing it and like listening to it afterwards. So it's like quite some time they spend with the audiobook, and I think it's a very personal decision if you want to take that time and dive into your past life and get reminded that that life will end rather sooner than later.
Thank you for sharing that story, and also for the surprising finding that not everybody maybe wants to record such an audiobook. Saskia and Héctor, are there any surprising findings in your research and or in your experience when you think about transgenerational heritage? Something you would not have expected, similar to Anja?
Well, for me, so I'm a mathematician, so this whole field of dealing with these predispositions or with these inherited variants that could be passed on was, of course, for me, difficult in the beginning. And also, I always said at the beginning to the medical expert I was working with, I'm fine with the data, so just the numbers, show me the numbers, that's enough for me. And then during the time, I got more used to that. And then in the end now, we really have, I also have contacts to patients. We are also working closely, and I think this is really nice and was a surprise for me, seeing this whole development then over the years. We are really working together with patient groups, and this means that we also, like, they can share their experiences with us, which helps us to also better understand what is really necessary for them. So, and this also can help us to really define our ways forward in research, because then we ask them, what is the most important thing for you? And we can include that into our research, which I think it's really valuable to have these both sides. Of course, we have the scientific questions, we have the medical needs in mind, and also the patient's perspectives. And here, of course, there are always some surprises that we never thought about at the beginning, and that also these patients are interested in the scientific part, which I was not expecting. And this means they also go to our conferences. They also take part in the sessions. They go to the workshops. They also present about themselves. And they really help us also to spread the information to all the patients, which I think is really helpful. And I didn't expect that at the beginning.
Interesting, yeah. I was just thinking, we talked a lot now about heritage, either in a medical or in a language way. But of course, also in the public domain, heritage, especially cultural heritage, is also something completely different. It's not only necessary passing on genes, passing on specific things to your family members. Maybe this is more closely to what Héctor mentioned, that language is also closely tied to culture, to identity. And we do not have Vicky here, who is sick today, unfortunately, but she's a sociologist working a lot with cultural minorities in Indonesia, queer communities, and deals a lot with how these people there can bring forward their identity and their culture. And if I look in the news today, a lot seems to be related to cultural identity, cultural passing on your identity to different groups or generation. Well, it's more prevalent in the US currently, of course, but also here in Europe. So maybe one of the last questions I want to pose to all of you and then open to the audience here is, how can public policy be informed by all of our specialties, by mathematics, by cancer, by linguistics, by palliative care, to promote a more positive way how we can talk about culture and cultural heritage? Is there a combined way, combined insights, or who are the stakeholders that really frame those policies and determine how we talk about cultural heritage?
Maybe I can say something. One thing is that heritage is a kind of outcome of heritage making processes. So heritage is nothing. It's only the result of this heritage making process. It's a result of heritagification or something like that. I don't know if this word exists, but you know what I mean by that. And there are many in society. We have many different social systems that try to guide to that contribute to these heritage making processes. We have policies, we have families making decisions in language management. We have the self management of us as individuals making decisions about our languages and language choices, and all these decisions are a kind of politicum, because there are in society we have many discourses about languages and what kind of languages belong to what kind of spaces, and in many countries it's very, I talked about that in the beginning. The most common linguistic reality is multilingualism, but we have politics based on monolingualism and education in society, and there is a thing that we were changing that, and there are a lot of projects trying to change that from the interdisciplinary work of different disciplines such as psychology, psycholinguistics, cognitive linguistics, and trying to show what are the positive effects of multilingualism. For example, from the cognitive perspective, we know that knowing more than one language helps you to learn better more languages. So there are a kind of transfer effect. If you learn if you are bilingual, you can more easier learn new languages. This is one aspect. Another aspect related to multilingualism is that is also correlated with less probability to have dementia or this kind of disease. And of course, there are also emotional and effects or another things related to the well-being of children that we can analyze from the perspective of psychology in interdisciplinary projects. And even I think one of the challenges, and I end with that, one of the challenges is not to show the positive aspect of multilingualism, but to combat, to fight against some myths that we share in society about multilingualism. So multilingualism is not a risk for social cohesion, for example. And this is in some public debates very spread as an idea, an ideology. And I think different disciplines can help us to fight against these myths.
Yeah, thank you very much for that statement. The hopes for our society rest with you and linguism to change that. Thank you very much to our panelists, Saskia, Anja, and Héctor. I now want to open the discussion to include all of you guys. Are there any questions you have either for our panelists or in general remarks, comments regarding this whole topic, transgenerational heritage? We have microphones here in the room. I have one here, Tobias has one. So please just either raise your hand or come forward if you have any questions. It could be either if you're from different specialties that to broaden the discussion, to include aspects that we forgot, or just anything you would like to share. Please, Paula.
Hi. My question is a little bit of context, because I work on a field that's similar to Héctor's. And within this idea of heritage, right, or like different generations, there is one group of people that were like me, the 1.5 generation, that eventually they started to hide this heritage. So they have it, they can speak it at home, they're fluent, for example, in these languages, but they kind of hide it and they don't show it to the outside world. And eventually, based on X or Y factors, they decide that this is going to be a very strong comeback for them. They're going to be very outspoken about their identity. And I was wondering if there could be some kind of similar case, obviously like in a metaphoric kind of way, in the area of cancer research or palliative care, right? Like if there's something that they've had that's been hidden, and because of a particular event, it just came back very strongly. If there's something that you could have encountered in your studies.
I can say something. Well, we had that one woman who was doing an audiobook, and she was really eager to talk about her traumatic experiences during war, which was obviously not a good choice of topics for like her 5-year-old child. Well, I think like having the opportunity to talk about her life, it was important for her to share stories she never shared before. I'm not quite sure if it's the same thing what you were talking about, but I experience it as a psychotherapist that every once in a while people like need to talk about things they never shared before, and they keep to themselves for years and years. So yeah, I experience it in a different context.
And even on a pure medical or on a pure cell level, like in medicine, there is a concept, a basic concept called, for example, the 2-hit hypothesis when it comes to genes and mutations, which says that sometimes for certain mutations, there have to be two things to come together. One, you have to be like susceptible from the beginning, but then you need an additional factor that triggers the deleterious onset of a mutation. Could be like either exposure too much to radiation, sun, or like environment toxins or whatever it is. But you are susceptible from the beginning, like it's dormant, it sleeps within you, and then it needs another trigger to become apparent, and so the disease can break out. So that's also like on a basic cell and biology level, kind of similar to what you mentioned. Yeah. And I also can relate to, not in the same way you can, of course, but even if you do not migrate from another country, even within countries with dialects, like I come from Upper Swabia, like normally I grew up with my parents and grandparents speaking Schwäbisch, yeah. I would never dare to do so here in Heidelberg, yeah, for obvious reasons. But maybe like in 10 or 20 years, I feel confident enough to do that again. But I can relate to that, of course, yeah. Thank you, Paula, for that question. Any other? Please, yes.
Hi, I'm an immunologist, so this is a non-specialist question. Maybe to Héctor, as you have connected language with politics. So what do you think about the political view heritage? Do you think that political views and like voting can be passed on from parents to children? How common is this nationally and internationally? And do you think that, is it good or bad? Do we need to do something in this regard?
Are you asking if voting, I think
political view and
ideologies can be, so to say, more or less passed between generations. Probably I talk about this phenomenon of the language of the kitchen, and maybe the kitchen and the dinner table is one of the most important places in which political ideologies are passed on. Yeah, because families tend to, of course, to get together in the dinner time, and of course there are different ways in order to explicitly or implicitly transmit some ideologies in these conversations. I don't know much about. I'm not a political science. I don't know if it has a correlation with voting decisions. Probably yes, but in the case of from the perspective of language, I would say, or the discursive perspective, I would say there are many. There are some particular spaces or moments in family life in which this transmission of ideologies can better take place. So.
There's a very good book of Elisabeth Wehling. She's analyzing political language and how it influences people on voting. It's not very inherited connected somehow, but might be interesting.
But what we know from the linguistics is that language ideologies are transmitted intergenerationally. So what I mean by language ideologies is, for example, if is this stigmatization of dialects in Germany. This is a linguistic ideology that are passed on between generations, and yeah.
Thank you for that question. Please.
Hi. So I have a question for Anja. So it was a fascinating topic, actually. So I was wondering, did you look into, or did you explore the reason? Did you explore the experiences of people who managed to complete the audiobook? So what were their experiences like?
Yeah, we asked about 25 people who recorded the audiobook, and most of them, or no, all of them were really happy about the experience, but they were also talking about how exhausting and sad and difficult the process of recording was. I think most of them liked the idea of like producing something they could leave for their children, but it was also hard for them to face the illness again, to like have it more in their mind again. There was a really interesting process that some patients said. They told their families about the audiobook, that they want to record it, and their family members were like really surprised and like saying stuff like, "Why would you do that? You don't need it." So their family members somehow managed to forget they have they're terminally ill, and they will die sooner or later. So this came back to their mind while doing the audiobook. but I think most people, like the positive experiences were stronger than the negative experiences.
Thank you. Any other questions right now? Yes.
Thank you, first of all, for this very stimulating cross-disciplinary talk. I have a comment that relates to the question of where data comes from, and I speak as of the perspective of a social scientist as well, as a social anthropologist. So Héctor mentioned that qualitative data analysis would look at practices, what people do, and that's important because people not always do what they say they do. But also what we look at is at relations. And the method or the methodology of social network analysis, I think, nicely illustrates how data can be analyzed through different disciplinary approaches. So there's a qualitative network analysis and a quantitative network analysis, while the quantitative one looks at, for example, the density of a network. A qualitative network analysis would look at the quality of relations, and that can give us insights into conflicts, for example, but also into how people cooperate with each other. Just to add that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that comment.
Just a broader question. So I think you worked out, well, what these bridges are between the different generations and the different fields, and also maybe how to strengthen them. I'm more curious about, right? I think there's lots to be learned when things really break down. So yeah, I mean, so I wonder, do you have any examples, or have you looked in any way, like where things just go terribly wrong and what we can learn from it? So between generations, like a child that no longer talks to the parents, or I don't know, like somebody no longer wanting to speak a certain language.
So in the case of language, it's a very common situation. There are many heritage speakers that at some point, mostly in the adolescent time, they refuse to speak the heritage languages at all. So they don't want to speak the language to their parents in a kind of revelation. So no, kind of revelation. To them. So it's a kind of identity work. And then some of them, they later on they regret this decision and try to reconnect with the language, and then they go to this is very common in the US with the Latin American community. The second generation or third generation, they abandon, so to say, the Spanish language, and then after 20 years they decide to reconnect, to learn this language, and they go to Spanish classes. And there are classes specifically for heritage speakers, but not many, and then they have to coexist with foreign language learners, and so they can speak better than the teachers, the Spanish, but they have worse or not so good grades as the other foreign language learners. So this is a conflict.
As a therapist, you meet people every once in a while who are not talking to their parents anymore. But I was thinking about, and I'm not quite sure if breaking down is the right description for it, but more about like staying connected, or the connection is really strong between generations. And I was thinking about transgenerational trauma. That's something, Katja, you know probably more about than I do. But there's a phenomenon described in literature where symptoms of traumatization are passed down to later generations. And I think one aspect usually is that the parents or grandparents never talked about it with their family members. So that's really like interesting how symptoms can be passed on without ever like speaking out loud about it, but somehow it works. Somehow it's really terrifying, I think. But that's probably less about like no connection at all, but being like too closely connected for some reason.
Breakdown in the medical field is of course like very much different, but I think also there, even if you have such breakdowns in terms of you have such a genetic mutation that may cause cancer, I've actually counseled some patients when you will always reach the point to say, well, this might affect your family, either your kids or it might have already affected other people in your family. And I've had some families where this reached a point where they mentioned, well, but I'm not on good speaking terms with my family. Like I don't want to tell them about this, or I'm not sure how to tell them about this. And where such a breakdown in terms of like having such a diagnosis, I've actually seen some families getting more connected again because they were kind of forced to talk again to each other because they realized like this might affect like their lives. We have to talk about, we have to reach out again. So this is how I think that even a breakdown in a medical sense in a bad way can turn out to like actually reconnect people again.
Yeah, and I think at that point it's also really important to use the help that is there in the clinic. So to use genetic counselors and so on, that can help you, first of all, to explain the patient himself, him or herself, what does that actually mean and how, I mean, how large is the risk and so on. And to use that help also, I mean, they are also there to help you then talk to your family. And I think this is really important and should be used and also, broaden up much more.
Thanks for the breakdown question, Chris. Although I don't have the universal breakdown as soon. There was another question, right? Yes.
Yes, thanks. Hi, I'm Leah. I'm a sociologist, and I have a question for all of you. I mean, you talked about generation passing on, and the way I would frame it is on a conceptual basis is to think about change and continuity in a way. And so I was wondering how in each of your discipline and in each of your project also you think of continuity and change at an individual level or on a more broader level, and what is the role of mutation socially defined or biologically defined? So I mean, what is how do languages evolve, or with regard to palliative care also, I can imagine that personalities also change in this moment of life. So how do you think about changes, and what is the connection between individual changes and societal or bodily changes and so on? Yeah.
It's a real interesting question. Thank you. Saskia?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And I think that this is something I'm really thinking of a lot because cancer development is the accumulation of different mutations. So it's changing all the time in a sense. And I think there's, of course, the temporal aspect of it, so that you have changes over time and you have a tumor in the end that should be removed, but then there's a risk for relapse. And this is again, probably most likely a change in the genetic pattern of the tumor. So I think there's this part of temporal changes, but also, of course, changes and differences, I think that's the right word in this setting, between different patients. And then, of course, you want to have, for example, a prevention approach that fits most of the people, but then it should also be precise enough to work for the individuals. And here, especially in cancer, this is quite heterogeneous. So the patterns that you see are really heterogeneous, and then it's our job as mathematicians and statisticians and computer scientists to analyze these patterns, see the changes that happen, but also see the common theme that they have to be able to develop the right treatment and prevention approaches. So that's really something we always look at. Thanks for the question.
And if I can comment on that, also from a physician, from a doctor's point of view in cancer care, I mainly work with breast cancer patients, both clinically as well as in my research. And our evidence changes on a daily basis, basically. Like, we can rewrite our medical guidelines in cancer care basically every 6 months because there's so much new evidence. There are new drugs, there are new techniques coming out. So sure, there's continuity in some form, but there are so many changes. And this means you both, on an individual level, you have to adapt to these changes. You have to stay on top of your evidence, of your guidelines. But also on a larger perspective, on organizational, on a hospital level, but even on a health system level, you have to have a system, an organization that is ready to adapt these changes. And unfortunately, health systems, and especially hospitals, are not really, well, welcoming change in a positive way. There's a lot of structural work necessary, in my opinion, to improve our healthcare systems and hospitals to adapt these changes more quickly. Because in the end, it currently comes down to the individuals working in the hospitals, whether you adapt those changes quickly enough, but there's no system, no regulatory framework that really helps you to implement those changes quickly on a larger scale. Comes from you too?
Maybe I can say something very quickly about what it is in linguistics. Maybe two things. One thing is in heritage linguistics, from the more linguistic perspective, researchers are interested in discontinuity, but they focus on changes in terms of competence. So they think heritage speakers, second generation speakers, have less competencies than the first generation. You know, then try to describe what kind of differences in terms of competence or skills they have. But they forget one aspect of language which is very important, and that's the sociolinguistic dimension of the language. So when do you have to speak one or other register of the language? What kind of, when do you use more formal registers, or when do you use dialect? So this is a kind of gap in the field of research of heritage linguistics, and I am preparing a research proposal, and the title of the proposal is Intergenerational Discontinuity in Dialects. So I am looking at what happened. I mentioned in the beginning, heritage languages are described as kitchen languages. So you expect that the heritage speakers speak like their parents, because they are only exposed to the language of their parents. And this is not true, because there are many other spaces of exposure to different varieties of the heritage language. In the case of Spanish is clear, or Spanish in Germany, for example. You have a community of Spanish speakers in Germany, and they interact more or less. There are different networks. Some of them are more dense than others, and the heritage speakers are also integrated in these networks, and so through interaction, through contact with other varieties, they also change their ways to speak the Spanish language. So they don't speak only Peruvian Spanish if they come from Peru, the parents of the heritage speakers, but they make innovations due to this language contact, not only with the different Spanish varieties in interaction, but also in education. So if they go to Spanish courses, they are going to be confronted with one variety of Spanish, mostly the variety of Spain, because they will have teachers that have learned Spanish from Spain, maybe because they studied in Spain, or so this contact with this other new variety that brings also to this continuity. So
we're slowly coming to an end of our panel discussion. We maybe have time for one last question, if there is one. Wonderful. Then we maybe have a little more time for coffee. Thank you so much for engaging in this. Tobias, yes?
Does it work? Oh, yes. I just, when we talk about continuity and discontinuity, I was wondering, I'm Tobias Just, I'm from the Marsilius-Kolleg, and I'm also a sociologist by training. And the question is also whether features are, you have a choice of adapting to it or not. And I think there, in this dimension, heritage might be different from the genetic. There is more or less it's good luck, and here there is still some space for individual choices, and but the degree probably is different. So I have no real question, but I just want if you can relate to this idea. It's also those who want to pass on something. Do they want to limit the choices of the next generation? I think that's or is it that you perceive the heritage as a limitation of your own choices? So, how could you relate to this idea?
It sounds very psychological. So, well, I was thinking about the audiobook, and I thought like an audiobook is like more something for continuity. And I was thinking about like one question that I was thinking about a lot during the research was how do the kids feel about the audiobook? And there are probably a lot of audiobooks that are just like really nice and really great for the kids, but every once in a while I think that people or the children get information about their parents that they didn't know before, either because they were too young or something the parents never told them, and then they hear it on an audiobook and they have no way to ask their parents about it, to talk about it, to get more information. And that's, for me, I feel like that's very challenging because they know something they have to deal with all by themselves, as no one else like in the family can talk about it with them. Heritage as like a limiting factor or something you can use for yourself, or it supports your own, helps you for your own decisions. I think that's a very, very big question in psychotherapy, like what is helpful and what you want to get rid of.
I think there are a lot of covered and uncovered decisions in this pass on of heritage. In the case of language, is clear, and we know there are, for example, some features that are more salient than others in dialect, for example. We can describe how the Peruvian Spanish is from the perspective of linguistics. We can describe what kind of linguistic features are different from the Spanish from Colombia or from Mexico, from Spain. And speakers are aware about some of these differences. And these differences that are more salient from this for the speakers can be in contact settings, for example, with other Spanish speakers, can be more likely to change. So if a Peruvian migrant is in Madrid, they tend to adapt and to avoid these linguistic features because they are aware that these features are part of the Peruvian identity they want to integrate. But there are another possibilities that you can use, and is also a common phenomena. You can use these salient features in order to strengthen your identity, not to accommodate, but to differentiate. And these two dimensions are very interesting in contact settings, for example.
I think that's a really nice closing remark and observation, that transgenerational heritage can be both limiting as well as enabling. And although you may not always have a choice whether it is enabling or limiting, at least in some small aspects, we have a choice to choose which kind of transgenerational heritage, how we would like to use it, and how it can become enabling or limiting. So thank you so much. Thank you for the panelists. Thank you for our wonderful audience here.